these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office. Experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
for insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all. In-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths.
We hold these truths.
With Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Okay, we're back. Welcome back, everybody. It's surprising that we haven't really done a podcast on climate change, on the environment, and all that, because it's certainly one of my big priorities in the House. I am the author of a bill called the New Energy Frontier. Specifically, that bill looks at research and development in the carbon capture space. But I apply the New Energy Frontier label to a much broader rational environmentalism, where we don't have to destroy our economy, but we can also think about our environment. It's a really important a discussion for Republicans to lead on, because generally speaking, I think our solutions are always the right ones. But sometimes we do have to agree that what the left wants maybe isn't all that bad. It's just that the way they have the solutions that they propose to fix those problems are, well, maybe wrong. That's a nice way of putting it. So I wanted to bring on an environmentalist, somebody who's been an activist for a long time, and also was recently at a hearing in the House and in the House of Representatives, that is, and also just came out with a book. Michael Shellenberger. Michael, thanks so much for being on.
Hey, thanks for having me, Dan.
So you just wrote a book called Apocalypse Never, and you were recently a witness at a hearing. What committee was that? What was the hearing?
Well, I actually just did two in a row. It's my third. I've done three. I've testified three times now in front of the House this year. The second last week was the House Committee on the Climate Crisis, and I testified and had a back and forth, and then right as the hearing was coming to an end, two of the Democrats just completely slandered me, attacked my character, said I was not an environmentalist, I had no standing, that everybody had debunked my articles and my book, and that nobody should listen to anything I had to say. And then the chairwoman gavelled the hearing to a close before giving me a chance to respond. And it was pretty outrageous. I just shocked. I'd never ever seen anything like that. Everybody I talked to, I live in California, so I don't really know DC that well, but everybody in DC that I talked to was like, they had never seen anybody treated like that. So I wrote a long article about it for Quillette. It was called, they asked me to testify in front of Congress, but the Democrats didn't let me speak. And it went viral, over the internet. And then I got invited back. And I testified on Wednesday, 2 days ago this week, and I was treated much better, I must say. In fact, they gave me all in, my staff timed it, and I ended up talking for 35 minutes, which is a pretty long amount of time to give testimony. So all's well that ends well, but it was a really weird, startling experience.
Yeah. Oh, they're terrified of experts that can debunk what they think. Especially when those experts have a history like yours. Again, you're not coming from some Republican think tank. You're not coming from, you're not an ex-Republican staffer on energy and commerce. Let's see. I'm gonna read through some of the history here. You've been named by Time Magazine as Hero of the Environment. You're a Green Book Award winner, founder and president of Environmental Progress. You've been called an environmental guru, climate guru, North America's leading public intellectual on clean energy, and the high priest of environmental humanist movement for your writings and for TED Talks. You are an advisor currently to the UN's panel on climate change. This isn't in my notes here, but I read it in your book. Okay, it's the Apollo project? Did I get that right?
Yeah,
what was the precursor to the Green New Deal, as you call it? I mean, you're one of the authors of this thing.
Yeah. In 2002 and 2003, I co-created the predecessor to the Green New Deal. We called it a New Apollo Project, advocated it for many years. I personally advocated to the Obama campaign team in 2007, and they ended up adopting it in in late 2007. He was elected on it in 2008, and we did about $90 billion in green tech as part of the stimulus program in 2009.
Yeah, we're going to get to that maybe closer to the end of the episode, but because there's a lot in that particular story. But before all that, I mean, how did you get interested in environmentalism? How long have you been doing this and writing about it and being active in it?
Well, I mean, my parents, I guess I've been an activist on this since I was around. I kind of dated back to the first fundraiser I held, which was for Rainforest Action Network in 1987 when I was 16 years old. I charged $5 to get in, and we let people drink beer. And I've been acting, my parents took us camping, so I loved the natural world. My parents were very progressive. I've basically been active in environmentalism for 33 years. I've been a climate activist for 20 years. As I mentioned, I was an advocate for renewables. I then changed my mind about nuclear power. I came to think that nuclear power was very important about 10 years ago. I've been campaigning for nuclear power in earnest for about 5 years. I've actually organized a pretty broad coalition of climate scientists, including James Hansen, Kerry Emanuel, Tom Wigley, a number of very prominent climate scientists to advocate for nuclear. We've actually saved a bunch of nuclear plants that were on the verge of closing. So, I still consider myself an activist. I'm really proud of the book. I also identify as an author, but I don't write books or articles just to kind of, in some academic reason. I write them because I'm trying to make the world a better place.
Yeah, and to do that, I think we need to get some truth out there. It seems like of all issues, the subject of the environment and climate change specifically, it's hard to find a place where there are more misconceptions and more deeply entrenched narratives out there that, upon further investigation, end up being almost entirely false. And your book highlights that in a pretty devastating way. Very, very data driven. You talk throughout the book how you've made sure that if you quote somebody, if you use their work, you double check with them and is what I'm writing making sense? Is this your intent? So it's a great resource on a whole variety of subjects. Whether the question that we're all going to be extinct, the question of what kind of fuels make sense, whether it's solar, wind, hydro, fossil fuels, natural gas, whatever it is. The question of just many different ones. I don't want to get through all of them, but it starts out with an interesting poll that you cite. 30,000 people around the world, 48% of them believe climate change will make humanity extinct. That's crazy. It's a lot of people that believe we are in dire straits, but how much of that is true?
Well, none of it. It's really, really nuts. Half of all humans think that climate change is going to make people extinct. That's so crazy. So the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has no scenario for any apocalyptic event. Not only that, but the IPCC does not predict that the long-term trends of declining deaths from natural disasters, declining deaths from infectious disease, it does not predict that either of those trends will reverse themselves. I mentioned I testified again in the House 2 days ago, and I explained, and I'm pretty sure it was the first time that most of the members of Congress had heard this explained to them. I explained that when people say that climate change will make disasters worse or will increase infectious disease, what they're actually saying is they're saying it will increase deaths from natural disasters or infectious disease deaths, all else being equal. In other words, if there had been no climate change, but we had still, consumed a lot of energy through economic growth. But the whole point is that not all else is equal. Climate change is a consequence of economic growth, which is made possible by large amounts of energy consumption. So the fact of the matter is, there's no scientific scenario. Anybody can invent a science fiction scenario, or we could have a hypothesis where something happens where somehow the 90% decline in deaths from natural disasters somehow reverses itself. I don't know what that would be, and I've been interviewing experts about it. In other words, so the population over the last 100 years has quadrupled globally, but deaths from natural disasters has declined 90%. Why? Well, it's because our infrastructure is better. It's because we have better weather forecasting. So if a hurricane is coming, we can evacuate or we can shelter in place. This is great news. I mean, this is just, we should celebrate this, that our friends and family are not being swept away in floods and hurricanes at anything close to the levels that they were 100 years ago or even 40 years ago. So now, there is some evidence, and this is where my opponents behave, I think, quite unethically in how they try to refute me. They say Michael's wrong when he says natural disasters aren't getting worse. Look at these extreme weather events. Well, an extreme weather event is not the same thing as a disaster. Every dictionary in the world and the IPCC defines a disaster as deaths and property damage. And on both of those metrics, on deaths, the number's been going down. And on property damage, there's been no increase in property damage from natural disasters or from extreme weather events. Once you take into effect that we're just a lot wealthier. So the increase in property damage due to the fact that we have more buildings and wealth in harm's way. So, I mean, I think this is, I mean, it's hard. I can't think of another issue where public understanding of something is so radically different from what the science says.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but it's obvious as to why, because if you're going to advocate for the most extreme policies, then you have to have an extreme problem. And so this is what's I should have said from the outset, this isn't a question, this interview in your book, it's not a question of, oh, is climate change real? Is it not real? That's not the question. I'm going to assume that your answer to that is yes, and that man-made emissions have something to do with that. Your book doesn't really even touch on that debate, does it? I mean, not in a huge way anyway.
I mean, climate change is real. It's not the end of the world. It's not even our most serious environmental problem. Does that mean we shouldn't take action on it? No, we should take action on it. In fact, as I mentioned, I am a full-time environmental activist, a climate activist as well. There are risks of making the planet warmer. I mean, all else being equal, we should not want the temperature of the planet to change. And the reason for that is because we've constructed an entire civilization, farming, cities, even protected areas for our endangered species. We've constructed it at a particular temperature, so we shouldn't want it to change. But there are 7.5 billion people on Earth. We have a massive impact on this planet, on the landscapes, and including on temperatures. So it's not shocking that humans are warming the planet, but it's not the most serious environmental problem. And the other thing is, people don't know this. I mean, it's amazing how much media coverage there is of climate change and how ignorant the public remains. And I don't think that's a coincidence. The public is ignorant because the media coverage has been so misleading. Mm-hmm. Carbon emissions peaked in Britain, France, and Germany in the mid-70s. They peaked in the United States 13 years ago because of the fracking revolution, which has opened up shale, the rock formation about a mile underground, to oil and gas. And so we've been, I pointed out the Democrats really didn't want to hear this. By the way, I am a lifelong Democrat and a liberal, but Democrats didn't want to hear this. Like the Obama Clean Power Plan, which he was going to implement through the EPA, the target was to reduce carbon emissions in the electricity sector 34% by 2030. I'm sorry, 32% by 2030. Carbon emissions declined 34%. 12 years earlier, by 2018, carbon emissions had declined 34%. So even the idea that you can't reduce emissions without having really strict pollution regulations or massive subsidies for renewables, it's false. We've been reducing emissions by producing a lot of natural gas. So almost everything that people think about climate change is wrong, in my view, except for the fact that it's happening and it's being caused by humans.
Well, what question I have too, and you don't go into a lot of detail on this particular question either in the book, which is what in fact is reversible. This is the question I'm always asking. Okay, let's say we manage to, how do I phrase this correctly? We managed to only have 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, because we took all this action. What does that translate into as with respect to sea level rising? And are we really going to reverse realistically? Is it even possible to reverse some of the more devastating consequences, like real things like sea levels rising like that? That's something people can understand, right? But is it even possible to reverse it? Because once you get past the premise, right, of okay, are we affecting the climate, then you have to talk about, okay, what are the outcomes of certain actions? And I don't hear really great answers to that.
Well, yeah, I mean, but first of all, just sea level rise. I mean, this is honestly the least of our concerns. I mean, so median level sea level rise, according to IPCC, between now and 2100 is 0.6 meters. That's 2 feet 2 inches. Would it be better for the seas to not have any sea level rise? Sure. But like the idea that that's somehow catastrophic is ridiculous. I mean, I point out that the Netherlands became a rich country while farming in some places 7 meters below sea level. Now, people have said to me, "Oh, but that's different somehow because it was subsistence. In other words, the land was shrinking below sea level, or that it occurred over a longer period." It's not. I mean, this idea that we are helpless against natural disasters or sea level rise is ridiculous. In fact, not only that, but like as an environmentalist, as a conservationist, my biggest concern is that humans, all of our big environmental problems, including species extinction, are a function of humans being too adaptable. We can eat food. We're overfishing is one of the big environmental problems that nobody ever talks about. We can suck food and protein out of any little niche on Earth, and so our impact is huge. The problem is not that we're not able to adapt; it's that we're actually so adaptable. So for me, I just kind of go. I mean, and you mentioned earlier. I mean, I know how I've been in this game long enough that I know that the scientists I interviewed would object, and they would say, "Oh, you're not representing it well." So what I did last year is I published all of the central claims around climate change in a series of articles in Forbes. I would email the transcripts of the interviews I did to the scientists before I published. I then published the articles. I made sure they saw them. They had months to get back to me and let me know if there's any problems with what I had written. That exact same language is in the book. I'm now in the middle of an argument on this particular question of my claim where I say climate change is not making disasters worse. And you get these people, they kind of go, "Oh, no, that's not accurate because we can show hurricane speeds are faster and whatever. And maybe we would have had fewer deaths had there not been any climate change." That's completely speculative. These are hypothetical statements. Those are not scientific statements. It's not what the IPCC says. So my problem, I mean, I have a lot of concerns here. I wrote the book in part because I have a 14-year-old daughter. She's fine, but her friends, literally, I interviewed them. They don't know if they're going to live long enough to have children. That's just nuts. I mean, like they, anxiety and depression are rising. I think I agree with Jonathan Haidt on this, probably mostly because of social media, but they certainly don't need a bunch of hysterical adults telling them that the world is coming to an end. And frankly, it's just offensive, the manipulation that many scientists who know better are engaged in, so that many of your colleagues in Congress, similarly, they think this is some kind of an apocalyptic threat like nuclear war. Nuclear war genuinely could destroy human civilization. Climate change, the only scenarios for that are science fiction.
Yeah, I think there's a psychological need amongst humans, especially as we continue to thrive and live in a modern society full of comforts and wonderful things. That you need something to fight against. This is deeply ingrained in human nature, and some of us take that drive and we join the SEAL teams. But people need something, and it's always, and your cause is more righteous if the enemy is bigger and more evil. And so I wonder if this has just been this giant groupthink to believe that we're all going to die, when in reality, like there really is this sort of happy medium where you don't have to be a denier, and you don't have to be an alarmist, and you could acknowledge that there's a problem, but as it turns out, all of these crazy conclusions or I guess outcomes are just not true. And the reason I asked I don't mean to keep focusing on this, but it just drives me nuts. The reason I keep focusing on the sea level rise is because, I mean, the question is this: if we just stopped emitting carbon dioxide right now, the sea levels have been rising for a long, long time. Who's to say it wouldn't just continue? And so it always, to me, what I'm getting at is this sort of economic cost benefit analysis that just doesn't seem to be part of the conversation when we talk about solutions to climate change.
Right. Well, I mean, yeah. So sea levels have been rising about a half centimeter a year. Now they're rising, or IPCC predicts they're going to be rising at more like a centimeter a year. So sure. I mean, there's definitely these changes. I mean, it's my view is that we should take action on climate change and continue to reduce emissions through the use of natural gas and nuclear, because there's just a lot we don't know, and so it's just, all else being equal, we should want lower temperatures rather than higher temperatures. Now, of course, all else is not equal, and so those
and I agree with that.
Yeah, climate policies should not make people poorer. They should not deprive people of the energy and food they need, and yet that's what many climate policies are oriented towards doing. And so one of the questions that was driving me crazy for the last 10 years, and that I wrote Apocalypse Never to answer, was why are the people who say they are most alarmed about climate change the most against the obvious solutions, which are replacing coal with natural gas and with nuclear power? Why, if you think climate change is the end of the world, are you against replacing coal with natural gas and nuclear? It doesn't make any sense. And so the book explores that. And what I find is basically that in the climate change as an apocalyptic concern emerges after the end of the Cold War, when the radical left, basically it became clear to everybody that there wasn't going to be a nuclear war between the United States and Soviet Union. That was already pretty clear. But that once the Soviet Union fell apart, the threat of nuclear war went away. And so the radical left needed a different vehicle for their apocalyptic worldview. And this does get to your issue of religion. The book the last 3 chapters of the book look at what are the motivations for apocalyptic environmentalism. I point to money, power, and religion, and ultimately view that this need to put oneself at the center of a kind of very big drama of being the hero that saves the world in kind of a Marvel Universe way, in some ways is very admirable, but when it's wrapped up in this apocalyptic and I think quite anti-human worldview, it can be very destructive, very depressing, very oppressive to countries that have not yet developed. And so what I basically conclude is that they're against the solutions to climate change because they're not really interested in solving climate change, or at least not fully committed, or not. That's not their primary motivation. They're really committed to alarmism, to getting the attention, to getting the social rewards of basically declaring the world fallen and themselves as unique in their ability to save it.
Well, it seems like there's different categories of alarmists, and some seem to be in this category of like, yeah, we know it'll hurt economic development. That's the point. Like they're nihilists in this regard. They truly want us to live in trees, even though, and they think they're super green because they wear their Patagonia outfits. And I'm like, I tweeted this a long time ago. As Patagonia was virtue signaling on Twitter. I was so proud of this. I was like, just so everybody's aware, all of the synthetic material that you that you use comes from the petrochemical industry. And they tweet back like, we're working on that. I'm like, okay, sure you are. Just stop it, And so there's a bit of a hypocrisy there. So that's one group, but I think there's others that truly want to tear it all down. But then there's this other group, and you go into a lot of detail on this. This is like some serious investigative journalism here on the history of Al Gore, the history of Tom Steyer, the people that actually got the tens of billions, or is it hundreds of billions, in subsidies under the Obama administration for these green energy projects, and they have a lot different history than I think people realize. So can you talk about that sort of other group of people?
Well, the first thing is just to look at the numbers. I mean, groups that are advocating action on climate change massively outspend climate skeptics. So this picture of fossil fuel companies funding climate skeptics to mislead the public is exactly backwards. I mean, we totaled up all of the money that Exxon had given to climate skeptics, and it was somewhere under 150 million a year. Well, each of the big environmental groups, Sierra Club, EDF, and NRDC, raise about 150 million a year. So that was total. I mean, there's somewhere between $500 million and $1 billion a year spent by environmental groups on climate change. You know, the skeptics have something like 10 or 20 million. I mean, it doesn't even compare. And where does their money come from? Well, first of all, they keep their finances super secret, but nonetheless, we were able to document significant contributions, over $100 million from natural gas and renewable energy interests. Well, two of the biggest natural gas and renewable energy investors are very well-known people, Tom Steyer and Mike Bloomberg. They both ran for president. They both have huge stakes in natural gas and renewables. Tom Steyer actually made his money with building coal plants in Asia, so he's even more hypocritical. They both are funding organizations to basically shut down nuclear power plants. That's how I discovered this, is because I was trying to figure out who were these people that were fighting us to shut down nuclear plants. Well, Sierra Club, NRDC, EDF, all of whom take money from natural gas interests that stand to make billions of dollars. I mean, one nuclear power plant can provide power for 3 million people. That's a huge amount of money. So really what you're looking at, these groups that call themselves environmental groups, often they're front groups for natural gas and renewable energy interests. And now, of course, there's a double game going on. On the one hand, I had these Democrats, they were like, on the committee, they were like, no, solar panels and batteries are already cheaper than grid electricity. And I was like, so then why do they need $2 trillion from taxpayers? Like, which is it?
Yeah.
Is it that the renewables are already cheaper than grid electricity, or is it that they need trillions of dollars in subsidies? Because it doesn't seem like you've got that message straight. There's huge
that myth is perpetuated all the time, right? Like this whole, it's cheaper, it's already a better deal. You know, it's just naturally winning the market. And it's like, is it though? You know, and they're like that doesn't seem right. But I want to get to that.
You better go with mine, so you don't need any more subsidies.
I don't want to go down that rabbit hole just yet, because we're going to I want to do a separately talk about solar and wind. You really go into detail about that. For right now, I want to talk about the interesting investigative journalism you basically did in this book. Jerry Brown was the other guy who was missing. So governor, I guess twice of California, right? So he was governor like way back in the day, and then he became governor again, I think.
Right.
Yeah, because I remember when I was living in California, I'm like, that sounds familiar, but and I'm not that old. But wow, you talk about, why does California right now could be basically emissions free if Jerry Brown had not destroyed nuclear development in California back in the 70s, it seems like.
Right.
And that was basically because his family had some interest in Indonesian oil imports, because there's some reasons for that. It's not really worth getting into, but the point is these supposed environmentalist liberals completely destroyed California's ability to have a carbon-free future.
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing story. I mean, yeah, so Jerry Brown's dad was governor. Right after he stopped being governor, he's hired to help the Indonesian dictatorship get financing to expand the oil industry in Indonesia. In exchange, they gave him the basically monopoly concession to Indonesian oil, which was low sulfur, which was an environmental benefit. They were burning oil back then in California for electricity. They wanted to build, the utilities, the politicians, they wanted to build nuclear power in California because it's pollution free, because nuclear in the 50s and 60s was understood to be progressive, environmentalist, good for nature, good for the natural environment. And Brown basically almost single-handedly killed off this incredible nuclear renaissance. I mean, yeah, California was supposed to be like France. So it should have had somewhere between 50 and 75% or more nuclear. Beautiful projects, including one that would have been very similar to this plant that exists in Arizona today, that recycles all of the wastewater from Phoenix. It was going to recycle all of the sewage water and turn it into fresh, clean drinking water. I mean, it is what you would want as an environmentalist, right? And so they killed off. And Jerry Brown had a direct financial interest in this. His family had a direct financial interest in it. So I just asked the question, how long has this been going on exactly? Well, it's been going on for a really long time. So-called environmental groups have been taking money from oil and gas guys since the 60s to shut down nuclear plants. I think it's scandalous. I haven't been able to get anybody in the mainstream media to cover it, even though much of this information is available to the public. There's nothing, I take pride in the fact that all of this book relies on the best available public information. So some of this information was surfaced, for example, in the Sacramento Bee, but it would be like page, A18 and it would be ignored.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's kind of an amazing story. But yeah, I mean, that's basically what's happened is that, nuclear, people are like, why doesn't Wall Street like nuclear? Well, because the bankers don't make enough money on it. Like the fact that, I mean, nuclear is truly in the public interest in that it's basically, these plants can last for 80 years or longer. They provide really cheap, reliable power without air pollution. I mean, this thing of here's another example. Environmental groups are always talking about changing the air pollution regulations, modifying the air pollution regulations, these credits well, if your plants don't produce any air pollution, then you're not involved in this whole regulatory apparatus to begin with. So, yeah, I mean, nuclear really threatened a bunch of economic interests, and that's a big part of the reason why it didn't scale up.
Yeah, it's something we're working on from a policy perspective. It's unfortunately not, I wish it were as simple as deregulating a few things, but unfortunately it's not. I want to read something else here that you write, that the U.S. government spent let me back up, actually. So like you said before, you started the new Apollo project. You call it the predecessor to the Green New Deal, and you were seeking out $300 billion for efficiency, renewables, electric cars, and other technologies. Said in 2007, our efforts paid off when then U.S. presidential candidate Obama picked up our proposal and ran with it. Between 2009 and 2015, U.S. government spent about $150 billion on our Green New Deal, 90 billion of which in stimulus money. Now, stimulus money wasn't evenly distributed, but rather clustered around donors to President Obama and the Democratic Party. At least 10 members of Obama's finance committee and more than 12 of his fundraising bundlers, who raised a minimum of $100,000 for Obama, benefited from $16 billion of the $20 billion in stimulus loans. This is the kind of thing that really makes people mad. And it's not as if this made the environment cleaner either, right? I think that's what's even more infuriating.
Well, actually, it made them worse. I mean, so when you shut down a nuclear plant and you replace it with natural gas, you're increasing carbon emissions.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Well, let's talk about solar and wind then, because it's, is this the panacea that people think it is? A lot of people will say, well, just wait till the batteries are there. And you point to a story where Elon Musk, and I like Elon Musk a lot. I wonder if he'd even agree with his 2015 comments. I think he's a true innovator, and I think he was, he's a visionary. But he did say in 2015, and you tell this story that he envisions this world of where we can live off of solar panels. We don't have to take up any more land space. We just put it on our houses, and these batteries will store the energy we need, and we have a total solar future. But what's really the truth there, and does the science really back that up?
Yeah, I mean, so this is also another one of these things that everybody should learn, like in high school. But every fuel that we use has something called energy density, which is just the amount of energy a given fuel can use for the amount of it that exists. So if you hold a lump of coal in your hand and a lump of wood, the coal produces twice as much energy. If you have a lump of uranium in your hand and a lump of coal, the uranium can produce 1 million times more. In fact, a single Coke can of uranium can produce all the energy I need in my entire life, including all my jet travel. So energy density determines the environmental impact, and it gets even more dramatic. A coal mine can have like 4,000 or 5,000 times more power density than a forest for going from wood to coal. And then similarly, like nuclear uranium mining, well, nowadays they just shoot hot water into the ground and the uranium comes out and then they, process it. But you don't have to tear down whole mountainsides. You don't have to rip up the earth. And even going from coal mining, where you're doing mountaintop removal, to fracking is a huge improvement because you're not destroying whole landscapes. You're temporarily modifying them. You're drawing pipelines on them. But there's clearly a progression from wood to coal to oil and natural gas to uranium. That's a benevolent progression, and it's towards more energy dense fuels that use less of the natural environment. Well, so when you go to modern renewables, since wood and dung are considered renewables, if you go to modern renewables, which are solar panels and industrial wind turbines, you still haven't changed the fuel because the fuel is still sunlight and wind. And the problem with sunlight and wind is that they are so energy dilute. You have to spread solar panels over 300 to 400 times more land than you need to cover with a natural gas plant or a nuclear plant to generate the same amount of electricity. So our nuclear plant in California, Diablo Canyon, it's on about 3 football fields. It produces enough power for 3 million people. If you were to attempt to do that with solar farms, which is our big industrial solar farms, you need to cover an area 350 or 400 times more with solar panels. Now, people say, oh, but aren't solar panels becoming more efficient? Well, sure, they became 2% more efficient over the last decade. So you can modestly reduce it to 360 times more land rather than 340 times more land. I mean, it's still 2 orders of magnitude more land that's required. And it's not just the land, it's 17 times more minerals and mining required for solar panels than nuclear. And solar panels produce about 300 times more waste than nuclear power plants. And so energy density, simple physical concept. It's like the gravity of understanding energy. Nobody knows about it. The wind industry actively denies that it matters.
Yeah.
And yet, you go read these histories. There's 2 incredible histories over the last 40 years that basically prove that you cannot have the Industrial Revolution in Britain in 1776, starting with a Watt steam engine. You can't have the Industrial Revolution with wood. Wood does not produce enough energy. It's just not power dense enough. There's not enough of it. So, okay, fine. So you power the society on renewables. Well, so then you have to kind of be like, how did we ever imagine we could? Like, why did we ever think that renewables could power society? Well, we all know why. I mean, you kind of intuit it. It's a belief that it harmonizes human society with the natural world. It heals our relationship to nature. The unconscious and mostly unspoken idea is that climate change is a consequence of humans having violated the natural order or the natural law, and we need to restore it. It's a religion. So basically, we're in the process of devastating pristine desert landscapes in California. We're now threatening to basically devastate the sandhills of Nebraska, where the whooping crane are, out of a religious belief that spreading transmission lines and gigantic blades, spinning steel blades or composite blades that kill eagles, bald eagles, golden eagles, whooping cranes, that's somehow harmonizing us with the natural world. I mean, I always point out, I don't argue with Jehovah's Witnesses. I didn't write Apocalypse Never because this is some academic concern. Jehovah's Witnesses aren't putting, solar farms and wind farms in pristine desert landscapes. Environmentalists are,
Yeah.
It's actually more the more you think about it, the more shocking it is that really somehow a huge section of the human race became convinced that we could basically do what we've long known we couldn't do, which was power a high energy industrial civilization on renewables.
Yeah. And you, I don't have it in front of me, but there was like some piece of work that you referenced from like the 1800s that kind of describes the utopian vision of these wind turbines and solar panels, way back then. And it's almost like we've never let go of this pipe dream, that can never be founded in basic engineering. And to your point, I want to quote something here. He said, one pioneering study found that in the case of Germany, where nuclear and hydroelectric dams produce 75 and 35 times more in energy, respectively, than is required to make them, Solar, wind, and biomass produce just 1.6, 3.9, and 3.5 times more. Coal, gas, and oil return about 30 times more energy than they require. So I actually want to understand what you mean by that. What do you mean by more energy than they require? Does this have to do with emissions, or what exactly are these numbers telling us?
No, this just brilliant study done by the most qualified group of scholars in the world. It's published in a peer-reviewed journal. They're German scholars, which means that they're in a national and cultural environment that is overwhelmingly pro-renewables and hostile to anybody who suggests there's a problem with them. So it's a remarkable study. It's the best done. It's also cited by Václav Smil, who Bill Gates refers to as basically one of the most important intellectuals in the world, certainly one of the most important energy analysts. And all they're doing is they're calculating the energy returned on energy invested. So after we, so it's really careful. It's hard to do, but they're able to do it well. When, I take my trucks that are powered by gasoline and we mine for uranium, and then we have our uranium enrichment facilities that are powered by coal electricity, and then we build nuclear plants, using fossil fuels. How much energy is then produced by that nuclear plant, and how does that energy compare to all the other energy inputs, whether fossil fuels or some other kind of energy? It doesn't matter. And in the case of big hydroelectric dams, nuclear power plants, coal powered plants, it's like between 30 and 70. When you get to solar and wind, it means that, and this is a problem because I can't remember what they say in there, what the exact number was. Maybe it's in the book, but I think it's something like our current existence, which is fueled by energy, of course. We require, I think our societies require something like 10 times. We have like a 10 times energy. We need like 10 times more energy returned than we put in to our society in general. So basically what it's saying is that when you're doing renewables when a high energy civilization is doing renewables that have such a low energy return on energy invested, they basically act as parasites on the whole system. So the reason why everyone goes, solar panels are getting cheaper. So if solar panels are getting cheaper, which is true, why did California's electricity become more expensive between 2011 and 2019? 6 times more expensive than in the rest of the United States, which is a huge number. Mm-hmm. We Californians spend 6 times more on electricity, or rather, electricity prices increase 6 times more than the rest of the United States. Well, it's because of all of the parasitical costs of solar and wind. What they do is they externalize their costs onto the rest of the system. And so those costs include these massive land use requirements. They require decommissioning costs, which are not included in the cost of solar and wind projects, but they are included in nuclear. It does not include waste disposal, which is included in nuclear, not included in solar and wind. And it does not include the cost of integrating these really unreliable energy sources. So right now, California has to pay Arizona to take our excess solar electricity during sunny days when we don't use a lot of air conditioning in California, and we have to pay Arizona to take it. Well, that's not paid by the people that are running the solar farms. That's paid by everybody that's producing electricity. So renewable, when you calculate what are called the system costs, or you might call them the civilizational costs of using renewables, they basically act as parasites onto the energy system. So that's what's explained. In other words, there's a physical explanation for energy and these different energy sources. So I sometimes get critics that go, Michael, why do you say nuclear is better than solar? All low carbon energy sources should be friends. Okay, I understand that. Those are my Democrat friends who want to have a big happy coalition of nuclear and solar to combat climate change. I get it. There's a political reason, though, that they want that. Physically, I, as an energy analyst and as an activist and a journalist, have to tell the truth. And energy density between nuclear and solar are just two totally different things. They're 2 orders of magnitude difference. And that has real world environmental and real world economic costs. And they're not hard to understand. It's made technical to confuse people. And what I tried to do in Apocalypse Never was to show the relationship between those inherent physical characteristics and both their economic and environmental effects.
It may be a simple way to ask the question is, okay, if carbon emissions are your only metric, that's the only thing we care about as the end result, and you have to power 5,000 homes, okay, or a city. Let's say you have to power the city. You can either do that with a nuclear power plant, or you can do that with a given solar farm. Which one and you have to build both, right? You have to either build the solar farm or you have to build the nuclear power plant. Which of those actions requires more carbon emissions?
The solar farm does still. I mean, so one, there's something that happens both when people measure the cost and also when they measure emissions, which is they say how much carbon emissions is the solar panel producing when it's producing electricity. And so if you measure it that way, solar, it's actually it's actually more carbon intensive than nuclear power plants, but it's pretty close. The problem is that, and the people do the same thing with cost. They go, if I go buy a solar panel from China right now, when it's producing electricity, when the sun is shining on it and it's producing electricity, it is cheaper than the electricity that we will get from these new nuclear plants in Georgia. It's true. I agree. The problem is that those nuclear plants in Georgia produce power reliably 92% of the year, and those solar panels produce electricity unreliably for between 20 and 40% of the year, depending on where you are. And that if you are and that simply producing electricity is not the end of the story. You need to provide electricity 100% of the time, and you need to perfectly match demand for electricity to be cheap. In other words, they are, and of course, solar advocates know this. They're just deliberately playing on people's ignorance. So those are called the system costs. So the full system cost of solar, for example, of a heavy solar system has to include the cost of A, paying California to take our excess electricity, or B, paying Elon Musk to build a huge battery center, which actually only can provide power for 4 hours, and C, burning natural gas. And when you do that, then suddenly you discover that the true system-wide, solar heavy system-wide intensity of carbon is actually going to be higher too, for the same reason that it's more expensive. It's got this hidden carbon or shadow carbon impact in the same way that it has all these external or hidden costs economically.
Yeah, so it's not an honest representation of the holistic system. If carbon emissions is the thing you care about, of course, it's not the only thing we care about. We also care about whether our lights turn on or not, which seems like a good thing to care about, which it doesn't do so well there either. But they'll advocate, okay, well, that's why we got to invest in more advanced battery storage. So, I mean, what's the realistic, I guess, let's say we had because I've asked this question to physicists before. I'm like, okay, so the batteries are what they are now. They're of course getting better, but there's got to be a theoretical limit as well to battery storage, and so what is that? Are we ever close to getting there? Even if we were, how big would these battery farms have to be, and how many resources and how much mining would we have to do to create these batteries? And how much land would they take up?
Right. So I'm going to say something about the material and technical question of batteries, but I want to make a point about how to the picture we should have and how we should think about it. I mean, I joke that, I wrote this for my kids who are ages 14 and 21. I dedicated it to them. And so I wanted the book. I joke that I basically wrote an environmental studies textbook with, 1,200 footnotes. A quarter of the book is pure references. I tried to write that environmental studies textbook, but hid it in a kind of work of popular nonfiction, because I want people to think about this whole energy and environmental system in the right way. Because once you do, there's certain principles you want to follow, and one of them that we want to understand is that civilization rests on cheap energy. It rests on cheap electricity. What makes electricity cheap is that it is a grid where supply and demand are perfectly matched. And the physical reason that is the cheapest form of electricity or a form of energy is because there's so few energy conversions. So what you want are very few energy conversions. What's in the public's interest and in the environmental interest, I believe, is to have fewer energy conversions. So an energy conversion is just taking sunlight and turning it into electricity, or it's taking uranium, splitting it so that it heats up, creates steam, powers a turbine, creates electricity. That's the process of conversion. When you go from having electricity to a battery and then back out of the battery into electricity, you're adding 2 energy conversions to the system. That's your first red flag. And you don't need to know anything about what kind of battery it is, or even whether it's hydrogen gas rather than a battery, which acts as sort of a storage system. All you need to know is that you're adding 2 energy conversions to a system, and doing so will make energy significantly more expensive. And that's why it's a grid rather than a storage system. Some amount of storage is required, but mostly what we do is we manage our power plants so that they go up and down with how people use electricity, which I think most of us know. It's like the big peak is when people get home from work and they cook and they watch TV and listen to the radio and play video games, right?
Yeah.
So that's how the system works. So I think I want to say that because I think storage is interesting, but I think that people rush into this question of storage without actually remembering what we're trying to do, which is to minimize energy conversions. Like you don't, and from an environmental point of view, just any environmental point of view, same thing. The economics and the environmental are completely aligned on this. For the most part, we want to produce maximal energy with minimal transformations of the natural environment. So if you're just a basic run-of-the-mill environmentalist or run-of-the-mill conservationist, someone that just thinks wants to see fewer species go extinct and have more habitat and have less land being used by humans, whether for cities or farms or energy production, it's not saying whether you think humans are bad or good or whether we have a right to or not. It's just saying if you think that we should have parks with birds in them and stuff like that, you want to minimize energy conversions. And that means building the lithium mines in Peru and Bolivia that make the lithium for Elon Musk's batteries. It means having fewer of Elon Musk's battery factory productions. I mean, mostly you don't want to do that. So that's why when you really look at it and you go nuclear, which is producing power for like 90% of the year, is also on that reliability level much more what you want. Solar and wind are producing electricity 20 to 40% of the time. So you're talking about not just much larger land use impacts, you're also talking about doubling, tripling, or quadrupling them so that they can be producing sufficient energy to be stored and then pulled out of storage when you need it. Now, on the just very simple technical point, I did promise to answer it, lithium batteries will never, ever be a significant source of utility energy storage. Never, ever. Forget about it. And I go through why the cost is just too prohibitively high, and it just takes too many batteries. Our lithium batteries are amazing for our cell phones, our personal computers, but even once they get into those Teslas, they're very heavy, and you've rematerialized what has been cars have been dematerializing in terms of less materials for more power for over 100 years. So I'm not even sure that they have much of a future in cars, but certainly not in utilities. And even most renewables advocates agree with that, which is why their big push now is for hydrogen.
Yeah. I mean, so are you against solar and wind? I mean, as a whole, or would you advocate for a kind of an all of the above approach where they're at least forced to compete in a fair way with the rest of our energy sources? I mean, what would be the right way to think about that, especially from a policy perspective?
I just don't know I don't know why we would be subsidizing things that are proven to be bad for the environment and bad for the economy. I mean, I know that policymakers in Washington need to make compromises. And even as an advocate for nuclear, I've had to make compromises and just accept that there's going to be subsidies for solar and wind. I'm not happy about it though. And I don't think that solar and wind and nuclear are all somehow the same. I mean, I have to say it drives me kind of batty, this idea that I'm being criticized from the left for not embracing continued subsidies for solar and wind. Well, first of all, wind's been getting subsidies for almost 30 years. There's no scenario for solar and wind to be independent of subsidies. Now, people point out, oh, well, nuclear plants have been subsidized too. Yeah, but first of all, nowhere near the same level. And also, nuclear plants are good for the natural environment and good for the economy, and solar and wind aren't. And I just think the evidence is overwhelming on that point. I synthesize it in the book. I don't have a religious opposition to solar panels. I don't think they should be banned. I just don't want to subsidize them. In other words, my neighbors, and I'm in Berkeley, and so everybody's got solar panels and Teslas.
Mhm.
Fine, buy a Tesla, but I don't know why I don't know why you should be getting $7,500 from me and other people who are even poorer than me to subsidize my rich neighbors to be able to drive a sports car. And I don't know why I should be subsidizing, 30 to 50% of the cost of my neighbor's solar panels when we have cheap grid electricity that's actually quite clean already and would be even cleaner if they stopped shutting down nuclear plants. So
Yeah,
for me, I go, it's not an economic thing. I think you have to I think conservatives had tried to answer this with like various market mechanisms, and they always end up losing because ultimately, if people want to subsidize solar and wind, they're going to find a way to subsidize solar and wind.
Yeah, it is one of the more infuriating things about California, where the cost to install solar panels is plus the battery storage. If you put that Tesla battery in your house, I mean, it's tens of thousands of dollars, but the California government gives you a tax credit for doing so. But it's still prohibitively expensive for middle class and lower income people. So they end up just subsidizing that anyway for the rich, so that they can feel good with their taxes. It's frustrating. Texas and in some other states as well, you can buy energy in kind of an interesting way, where you can basically choose your energy price and say, I want it to be all solar. And then they can give it to you. Say, okay, this comes from solar, but you're going to pay for it. That seems to me to be the most efficient market mechanism if you desire to feel good about your energy use.
It doesn't
No?
work. No, it's a
It doesn't.
complete scam. It's a total scam. I mean, in fact, it's totally dishonest for sort of the reasons I was mentioning, which is that, so first of all, here's the first part of the scam is that, well, the first thing is that we have a single grid, right? So electricity is considered by economists to be a natural monopoly because we decided early on, 100 years ago or so, that we weren't going to allow 5 electric companies to be stringing up electric wire to our houses and to power plants. Like that would be insane, like a huge, obvious collective action problem. And so instead, about a third of our utilities are just publicly owned and the other 2/3 are privately owned, but they've always been heavily regulated so they can't price gouge. And so you had this arrangement. Now, there's been some deregulation, but that's basically the same system. Then you have these utilities under pressure from basically Shell natural gas and renewable energy companies, and environmentalists have said, we're going to go get some consumers to choose to pay more or choose in some other way to get electricity from solar. But actually, the electricity is not 100% from solar. They're buying what are called renewable energy credits.
Yeah.
And the whole credits thing is just insane and corrupt. I mean, just a total rat's nest of conflicts of interest and double counting and double dipping, where basically the same renewable energy is being counted as, say, meeting Oregon's renewable goal as also being used by a county in California to meet its renewable goal. I mean, it's actually such a mess that we started to do more research on it, and it just became so complicated and so obviously corrupt, and there'd already been so much media coverage of it, but that had never gone anywhere because nobody seemed to care about it. So no, I mean, look, it's just this is where I think Republicans and conservatives need to get their heads aligned a little bit more with the physics and the science, which is that electricity is cheap because it is a grid, and it's a grid because it's a natural monopoly. And that means that it doesn't behave like retail economics. It doesn't behave, and we have to stop kind of imposing some Adam Smith model of competition onto electricity because it's just different. And it's why there are many capitalist economies in the world that have a socialist electricity system. It's not required, but if you compare just the various machinations that have been done, particularly since the so-called deregulation phase of 20 or 30 years ago, basically it's all been ways to increase the cost of electricity by selling people things that they don't need, and usually we're having negative environmental effects. I think if you're really trying to defend the public interest, you want to maintain a heavily regulated electric utility where they're making decisions to basically move your power densities higher, not lower, and moving your power sources to being more reliable and not less reliable.
Yeah, and I think maybe the reason that I ask about that is because we see that the public desires so badly to
Right.
buy like renewable energy. So it's like, okay, fine. If you're going to do it, this seems to be the most market efficient way to do it. But you're saying even that system is corrupt. So that's good to know. We'll have to look into that.
Cap and trade was the same thing. Cap and trade, which died, as you know, in 2009. 2010. It was actually killed by Ohio Democrats in the Senate, passed the House. That thing, using so-called market mechanisms, was the most corrupt special influence. I mean, everybody just got their credits and subsidies and mandates. It was such a mess. I mean, it was like whatever, hundreds of pages and just all sorts of junk in there. Nobody could possibly read it. It's really good in retrospect that it failed, because it actually would have slowed the expansion of natural gas, ironically. So, I mean, that's why I wanted for Apocalypse Network. See, this is my disagreement with people like Bjorn Lomborg, who's my friend. I like him. But like Matt Ridley's, and who are more on the right or more libertarian, they're always trying to show these economic models and always trying to emphasize these market mechanisms. But I think if you don't understand the physical principles of energy, then you're going to get swindled. That's why it's like you want to minimize energy conversions. You want more reliable power plants, not less reliable power plants. You want higher energy densities. If you follow those three things, we're going to continue to get significant improvements, both in environmental quality and in affordability.
Yeah. No, I don't think there's any disagreement there. What I was talking about, I don't believe is a cap and trade system. It's more of like a private energy company that sort of like buys units of energy and then sells them on the market. They don't own the power lines. They don't own the sources. They own the electrons. And they're selling
financial. It's actually the financialization. They're getting regulations they're basically getting regulations, usually through the public utilities commissions of the different states, to basically be able to sell financial products that are completely detached from the real world, that are basically wealth transfers from ratepayers to really people in the financial industry, misrepresenting what's happening environmentally. I mean, we have this whole thing called environmental social governance, ESG movement in the investment community being promoted by BlackRock. Basically, we're working on this, looking at studying it. It basically would make each of those criteria worse. I mean, it's kind of like, how else would you justify policies that are bad for the environment than as good for the environment? I mean, that's much of what renewables are. I mean, renewables are bad for the environment, full stop.
Yeah, and I think that's your main point, obviously. And we haven't even talked about wind yet. Okay, so let's talk about wind. So the problem with wind, which you lay out in excruciating detail in your book, is that it has been majorly underreported how bad wind turbines are for birds. And President Trump has sort of joked about this, and then he's derided by the media and Democrats. Oh, it's just Trump going off again. But it turns out it's actually a pretty serious issue, and possibly much more serious than we thought.
And it shows how alienated, I don't know if I wrote it somewhere, I was like, how alienated most environmentalists are from the natural environment. That you would think that putting spinning blades into the airshed, into the wind, that insects, birds, and bats use as habitat effectively, as the natural energy flows that transport them, that allowed the species, that gave rise to the species in the first place, since these are species that need to move, that you would think that would be somehow good for the environment is amazing. Like, it just shows how, because remember, when I was a kid, I mean, I write about it. It's like my parents, we would go to the desert and they would be like, how it doesn't look like there's much out here compared to the redwood forest that we were in or something. Mm-hmm. And they were like, it's not true. It's full of life. Let's go take a closer look. Like, that was always sort of, Ranger Rick, like, like, let's go and see the nature all around us, and then to go, well, no, that's the wind is empty of life is just nuts from an ecological point of view, from an environmental point of view. So conceptually to put blades that spin in those spaces is you've already got a big red flag.
Yeah.
But of course, the impacts are gigantic. And I mean, I point out that, I think another most underreported studies that scientists are having a huge debate over why there's been these big declines of insect populations around the world. Well, he'll look at like pesticides. Well, the problem with pesticides is the pesticides have become a lot less deadly over the last 50 years, of course, right? Because we're better at making them, and they're much less bad they don't last as long. They break down faster. Glyphosate, the famous Monsanto, now Bayer pesticide, is just a much milder version. It might still have problems, but it's a much milder version than the herbicides that existed before that. So you kind of go, do we really think it's pesticides that are causing the insect decline? Well, maybe one of it would be the wind turbines, and they find these big insect declines in Germany. They would take the wind turbine blades down and they have to clean them because they get so coated in insect biomass that they actually impair the efficiency of the turbines. But we see condors, bald eagles, whooping cranes, golden eagles. The wind industry says, oh, house cats kill more birds. House cats kill robins and sparrows and starlings and jays. And good riddance to those crappy little birds, by the way. I'm a bird. I love birding. I love birds. But like birders aren't like, oh my God, honey, I saw a jay today. I saw a robin today. Nobody brags about that because those birds are not special. They're not scarce. They're not endangered. They're not large. They don't take. These big birds are special because they're rare, and they're rare because it's much harder to reproduce. You reproduce more slowly. You have fewer chicks in a brood. So it's incredible. And it's incredible that the environmental groups have signed off on this, and shows how alienated I think we all are from the natural world. And I have to say, I will say it's interesting. I saw A Star Is Born, which is this, lovely remake by Bradley Cooper. I don't know if you saw it. I'm not spoiling anything.
Yeah.
There's a scene there. One of the most decisive moments in the movie where they go and they see that he had sold the family land to wind developers, and just how heinous it looked. And I'm sorry, I don't know if you're from any of these places, or you represent any of these wind areas.
No.
It was devastating. Ecologically, and they showed it for the first time, I feel like, in Hollywood. They'd shown it accurately rather than the misleading ways that wind turbines are depicted by the wind industry and by others. Of course, they're having a massive environmental impact. How could they not? And in particular, scientists are speaking out. There was a paper 2 or 3 years ago where the scientists warned. They were like, look, this species of bat will go extinct if wind turbines continue to expand. And now there's a big fight about the whooping cranes because the Democrats, they want to build a super grid to bring electricity across the plains to the East Coast. And they want to build transmission line right through the sandhills where the whooping crane are. And the number one cause of mortality for whooping cranes is transmission lines. So you're kind of like, what are we doing? Like, how did this become? How did we get to this point to justify doing these horrible things to the natural environment? But of course, we're doing them in the name of saving the natural environment.
Yeah, and that's the irony. But God forbid we build a natural gas pipeline that has less emissions, is responsible for almost all of the emission reductions we've had in this country, and is actually reliable. And we could export to countries that, burn a lot of coal, which is something I'd like to see.
Yeah, and doesn't reach into the sky and chop the wings off of golden eagles.
Yeah, it's a horrible image. And other countries have done this. Is the last thing I want to ask about wind and solar. And if you still got time, you debunk quite a few things regarding the environment. So I've still got a lot of questions. But on wind and solar,
I want to make sure we talk about nuclear energy, because Republicans their leadership on nuclear energy is desperately needed, and it's not showing up where it needs to show up right now.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's talk about that. So, I guess the best way to set that up is the dichotomy between France and Germany. So, Germany has a Green New Deal. It's had it for a while. It's been about $580 billion, trying to remake their entire electrical grid along solar and wind. How did that turn out? And what does France look like as far as their power usage?
Right. So France and Germany are a really powerful and important and I think of high scientific quality cases. So the risk with energy, with everything you can do, is you would be cherry picking. So you would see people say, and that kind of gave an example of that. Look, my solar panel, when the sun is shining on it, produces really cheap electricity. Well, yeah, but that's not the same as powering a whole civilization. That's not powering the United States of America. And when you have to do that, there's a lot more required, obviously, than just a single solar panel. With Germany and France, you get two high energy, wealthy, highly developed nations right next to each other. Yes, there's some cultural differences, but basically, these are two very comparable countries. And all you need to know, and France is heavily nuclear, and Germany is moving away from nuclear towards renewable. All you need to know is that France spends almost half as much for electricity that produces 1/10 of the carbon emissions per unit of electricity as German electricity. For me, that's sort of the most powerful that, and that. So after 40 years, basically, of policies, or in the case of Germany's renewables revolution or attempt, I should say, for 20 years, it's been not 40, but still you get a really apple to apples comparison. And yeah, Germany will basically have spent $580 billion by 2025 to make its electricity twice as expensive, and yet still producing 10 times the carbon emissions as France. So, I think this is where, at the end of the day, I think people kind of have a mystical view of these kinds of things, or they kind of they don't really know that really, the outcomes are directly related to your power plants. Like, there's not sort of some other thing. Efficiency, I first of all, energy efficiency happens like on its own. You don't really need. There's some role for government. I'm not saying there's not, but when you buy a new gas heater, it's much more efficient than the one that your dad bought, and then the one that he bought was more efficient than the one your grandfather bought, right? Like it just, things get more efficient. It's not the big determinant. What determines it is what power plants you're using. So that's why I think the Germany France example is so powerful.
Okay, so on nuclear, then, I mean, you're not going to find much backlash from Republicans on pushing for nuclear. The question is how to do it. So, I mean, what is, in your research, what looks like the best policy measures to actually first thing you got to do is save nuclear, because it's consistently still under attack by environmentalists, which is, again, mind blowing for all the reasons that we've been talking about. But it is expensive. I mean, the overhead cost of building a nuclear power plant are enormous. So even if you don't have all the environmentalist, radicalist backlash, it's still difficult. And as you've already mentioned before, like, even the units of energy are more expensive than even solar. Now, that of course doesn't capture the whole picture, but it's a talking point that is used, and so we have to move past that. So what's the best policy to get this going?
Well, let me. This is the most important thing that we're going to talk about, and this is why I was so excited to talk to you in particular, because I think you'll get this. Let's just back up to something that's in the news right now. It now appears that China is building a uranium enrichment facility in Saudi Arabia. Wall Street Journal reported it. New York Times is reporting that this is being taken extremely seriously by the White House, by the State Department, by Congress, as it should be. Why? Because if you are able to enrich uranium for civilian nuclear power plants, then you can potentially be able to enrich uranium to make a bomb, which means that Saudi Arabia is developing the capacity to make a bomb. And it's doing it with our most important geopolitical rival that appears to be in the process of committing genocide against its Muslim minority. This is of great significance to national security, and I think to the whole project. This may sound strong, and it is strong, but I think it's true. I think it stands as a significant challenge to what we consider Western liberal democratic civilization. China and Russia do not share our values. When you do nuclear energy of any kind, whether it's a nuclear power plant or an enrichment facility or a reprocessing facility, you are in the sphere of influence of the country that's helping you. Full stop. The line between soft power and hard power runs directly through nuclear energy. Every time you build some big infrastructure project with a developing nation, that developing nation is to some extent, that's soft power, that developing nation is to some extent in your sphere of influence. When it's nuclear energy, you are you're almost making a military alliance. This is of huge consequence. So why is Saudi Arabia, longstanding U.S. ally in the Middle East, working with the Chinese? Because the Democrats said that that the United States was not going to help Saudi Arabia because they wanted to do uranium enrichment. And the United States, now let me just, this is going to sound technical, but it's not, and you probably already know it, but for listeners, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has been signed by most nations in the world, is the big treaty that governs nuclear weapons. It has a number of provisions, one of which, though, is that every nation has the right to nuclear energy for civilian peaceful purposes, full stop. If you are a nation, you get to have nuclear energy. That's your right under the treaty. Everybody supports that. The United States, and that includes nuclear power plants and uranium enrichment for peaceful nuclear power plants, and reprocessing of used fuel also for peaceful nuclear power plants. The United States, Democrats, in their war on nuclear, has created an additional prohibition that goes way beyond the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is to prohibit the United States from helping countries to enrich uranium and reprocess plutonium. Why? Because we say it's going to get them too close to being able to have a bomb. Well, but what do you do then when Saudi Arabia says we want to be able to enrich our own fuel? We say go work with the Chinese. This is insane from a national security standpoint.
And just historically speaking, was this because of, I'm sure also because of, again, I'm not sure what year that this happened, but I'm assuming it's surrounding the Iran nuclear deal when they wanted those negotiations to go well. Is that true?
It actually happens under Carter.
Okay, this is way back in the day.
Yeah.
This goes way back further than that. Okay.
Yeah. So you have, basically it's interesting. And I haven't completely, it's not in, a lot of this is not in the book, but I couldn't quite get to some of the bottom of it, but basically there were mixed motivations, but basically the Democrats in the Carter administration, which included a number of people from the big environmental groups, including NRDC, were Democratic, liberal, I would say new left, what we might today call radical left, people who really wanted to get rid of nuclear, like all of nuclear. And this was a very early idea. Right after the bomb, the father of the bomb, so 75 years ago, the father of the bomb, Robert Oppenheimer, other Democrats wanted to try to control nuclear energy everywhere in the world, including uranium mines, power plants. They really wanted the United Nations to have full control. And that never could have happened for a variety of reasons we can talk about. But basically, it was a failed ambition to stop the spread of nuclear energy, both for power and for weapons. You get to the Carter administration, that's when they started pushing for these additional requirements beyond the NPT. Well, so this argument, this has never been, Democrats have never had an answer to this problem because there is no answer. When you say, well, wait a second, what do we do if Russia or China wants to help a country do uranium enrichment or reprocessing? The Democrats say, well, we should try to pressure them not to. Well, the question has been called, and now it's been answered by Saudi Arabia. And so someone might say, and I think it's not unreasonable, you might say Saudi Arabia is just too oppressive of a regime. It killed Khashoggi, and it's not okay. And so we're not going to be allies with Saudi Arabia. That's an honest argument. Like, if you don't want to have Saudi Arabia as your ally, fine. But Saudi Arabia has been the United States ally, for decades. And I'm not saying it was always the best thing in the world. I'm not defending it, but I am saying if you are letting your major ally go work with the Chinese, you are basically losing them as an ally, as a military national security ally in the region. And that is very, very bad. And so my view, and this is about to come out, is that the United States has got to just drop that requirement. It's got to realign. The United States must realign its policy with the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I mean, right now we're basically undermining the treaty. The treaty protects nations the right to enrich and reprocess. If we're not going to do that, then the Chinese and Russians will, and that means that we're going to lose potentially significant nations around the world to not just our rivals, but to countries that are actually anathema to democracy, to freedom, to individual rights. I mean, the stuff that China is doing, not just with the potential genocide, but the facial recognition, the control of its citizens, it's creepy and wrong. And while I don't think Russia is as large as or could be as big of a threat as China, similarly not committed to our values. And I think this is of great national security importance and goes way beyond whether or not to, I mean, and it answers, I think, in some ways, these questions of, well, what do you do about today's plants and what kind of plants should we have? What I think it means is that if we don't want to turn the globe over to China and Russia, then we need to compete with them to build large nuclear plants, which are the plants that nations want to build. We need to commit to helping nations get uranium enrichment and helping them to reprocess. And if we do it, the world's going to be a better, safer place than if the Chinese and Russians do it. But it's not a question of whether it's going to happen, because it clearly already is. And Saudi Arabia is just the first of these countries to go with the Chinese. It could be many more that follow.
Right. It's scary. It's similar. It's a similar conversation to the 5G question in Huawei. It's like we need to be innovating and producing so that we can outcompete them, instead of just asking our allies, hey, could you just forego this technology, please? Even though it's good for you. It's not a great argument, and they tend to scoff at us. Okay, but it goes back to the original question, though.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Nuclear energy, it's our most dangerous technology. It's our most important dual-use technology. It's a world-changing, just a massive revolutionary technology. 5G, which is our entire ICT system that all of the economy rests upon. Pharmaceutical drugs, which obviously billions of people rely on, millions of people rely on. How are those not three strategic industries that the United States should dominate? I mean, I've never heard, I can't understand why would you, this is where I think Republicans and the libertarian stuff and I think the reversion towards nationalism is very healthy for Republicans, because it seems like Republicans have been the first to kind of go, and this is what I'm sort of saying about electricity too. You can't be some kind of market dogmatist where you impose markets on things that should not be like Saudi Arabia building that enrichment facility. That's not something that's not a government or market thing. This is, and 5G, I mean, or how about drone manufacturing? When did it be okay for the United States to not manufacture our own drones? I mean, we already know the mishigas that the Chinese have pulled with their drone manufacturing. It's already been revealed on it. So you don't kind of go, our drones are going to cost 20% more than Chinese drones, therefore we're just going to use China. No, it's a national security issue. You do not allow that to occur, and the same thing goes for nuclear. Yeah,
I actually have a bill on the drone issue that relates to DHS. DoD already can't buy parts for drones made from China, but we want the same thing for Homeland Security as well. Okay, but it gets back to the original question, though. So we all agree on that, and I agree there's a healthy shift towards more nationalistic economic policy as it relates to national security and really the sort of conflict of civilizations that I think is it should be clear to everybody by now between the U.S. values and Chinese values. But again, what's the right for policymakers then? How do you get nuclear to be on a secure footing from an American standpoint? Do we have to subsidize it? We really don't like subsidies. Is there ways to deregulate it? Is it simply investing in the overhead costs? What is it? Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you for your leadership on the drone issue. And it's just, I suspected you would understand these things intuitively. I think the first thing the first thing with nuclear is we first have to understand that this is a national security issue. Okay, so there's climate implications. Yep, there's economic questions. The spread of nuclear energy around the world has been understood by the U.S. government, or used to be understood by the U.S. government, as a national security question, as a national security concern. China doing uranium enrichment in Saudi Arabia is a U.S. national security concern, full stop. Okay, so that's the first thing. It's like we don't kind of
we got that part. But the question is,
so
how do we do it?
You don't kind of go, we're going to have air superiority, but it can't be too expensive. You know what I mean? You go, we're going to have air superiority. Like, we're going to have hearings and make sure that the Lockheed Martin isn't stealing money from us again. But, but you're gonna have air superiority. So let's just first decide to have nuclear energy superiority. That's the first thing.
Yeah.
Second thing is then you go, what does that mean? Well, what it meant in the 50s was that you had what you called national champions. These are private companies. It was Westinghouse and GE. And in the 50s, Eisenhower and the head of the Atomic Energy Commission, they just called the CEOs into the White House and they're like, we want you guys to make and market nuclear power plants in the United States and around the world. And they were like, okay, that was how they worked in the 50s. Today, if you call GE and Westinghouse, they're going to be like, we don't make nuclear power plants anymore. So what do you do? Now, the key to having competitiveness, I think our competitiveness, first and foremost, comes from the fact that we're America and that we're the greatest country on earth and that we're the only country that really is committed to democracy and freedom, unlike the Chinese and Russians. So that's number one. But the second is you have to sell your experience, and particularly the experience of your construction crews that actually make the freaking machines in the first place. So the Chinese and Russians are building 37 nuclear reactors around the world and in their own countries. The United States is building 2. Okay, that's not the end of the world. It's not great, but it means that the people who are building those 2 reactors in Georgia are like the most valuable manual laborers in the United States right now, the most undervalued. They should, after they finish at Vogtle in Georgia, they should move up the road to South Carolina and finish construction on 2 reactors, identical reactors to the ones they just built at a place called Summer. And after those construction workers and managers have experience building 4 reactors, they're going to be ready to build those reactors around the United States, around the world. And we do what we always do, which is that we diffuse that ability and those experience, and we start and we compete then with the Russians and Chinese by being like, yeah, they have experience, but our guys have experience too. Because experience is the only thing that matters. It's the only thing. Like it's just like anything, right? Like if you don't know how to, there's so many people in this space. Bill Gates is the worst actor of all by far, who's like, I know how to make software programs, therefore I know how to make a nuclear power plant. Really? I mean, even guys who make, some of the problems that they had in Georgia, where they hired guys that are like the best welders for fracking wells, for natural gas. They're the best welders for natural. They had to get up to nuclear welding standards, and it was like a nightmare. Like the welders were unhappy. The regulators kept saying the welds weren't good enough, because everything with nuclear has to be, it's the highest quality.
Yeah.
So that's the program. And then we just go and tell everybody, we'll build your nuclear plant. We'll help you build uranium, and we'll help you do the uranium enrichment. We'll help you do the reprocessing. And after the fuel's out, we should just take it back to the United States. It's incredibly valuable to have. Take it off their hands. That's what the Russians are offering. So that it's just plug and play. If you're Hungary or Turkey or Brazil or Argentina or Bangladesh or South Africa or India or wherever, and Americans, you call up the United States of America, and the president answers the phone, or the president himself is selling these, and they go, yep, we'll take care of it all. We'll finance it. We'll build it. We'll train your people how to build it with us and operate it. We'll take the waste after it's done. We'll provide the fuel, everything you want. We're going to take care of the whole thing. And it turns out to be a pretty darn good business too. It's not like this is completely, like, it's not like subsidized. It's like they're paying for the electricity, and it's great for American businesses and workers.
Would we be able to do a lot more for a lot less money if we basically allowed our commercial domestic nuclear power plants to use more highly enriched uranium? Because so I come from the Navy, so I know that we're pretty good at sticking dangerous nuclear reactors in submarines and putting them below water, and that seems to work okay. We can power quite a bit with these things, but the uranium is enriched upwards of I don't know, it's really, really high.
Yeah.
Whereas nuclear power for commercial service is only 3% or something like that. So the reason we allow it to be higher in the military is because, we control it. We're the military, but it's far more efficient. So would that be yeah.
Of course, it's crazy. These are regulations that were advocated by anti-nuclear people who wanted to make nuclear expensive. I cite them in the book explicitly saying that was their strategy. In fact, there is a secret Sierra Club memo, which is great, where they say that that's what they're trying to do. And the nuclear industry, basically suffering from battered wife syndrome, basically gave them whatever they wanted. The AEC, these are, not particularly socially adept individuals who were just cowed. They were bullied into these stupid regulations that have no basis in safety. Yeah, I mean, of course, the fuel should be enriched higher. You have fewer refuelings, which are one of the most expensive parts of operating the plant, right? You have to shut the plant down to refuel. So yeah, of course. I mean, I think though it all flows. I think the funny thing is, when I go to Washington or when I talk to people, I think people just forget that nuclear energy is a dual use technology. I've been saying it in my hearings and reminding people of it because I think they kind of go, and understandably, and to some extent, that's the success of nuclear, is that we go, no, there's power plants, and that's one thing, but then there's weapons, that's totally separate. And that's true for the United States. There's a myth that power plants produce the weapons grade plutonium for our weapons. It's not true. We have separate plants for that. But in poor and developing countries that are beginning their nuclear programs, the two things are just much more related. And not only that, but there's a kind of machine fetishism where people somehow think that what matters in terms of being able to have capability to create weapons is just the machines. And to some extent, that's true. It's the enrichment and the reprocessing. But what gets you latency, that's what it's sort of called, nuclear weapons latency, is the scientists and the engineers. It's just the technical people, Mm-hmm. And the view that everybody came to in the 50s, Democrats and Republicans, was the right view, the view in the United States, I should say, but around the world too, which was it's just nuclear energy. It's going to spread. It's just it's not, the ability to split the atom is done at the laboratory level. It can be done by scientists at any college lab. It's not, you don't need to be rich actually to use nuclear energy. And so it's better for the United States to be involved in the spread of nuclear energy rather than, just attempting to sort of snuff it out, which is the position that the radical left came to and never has been honest about in the late 60s.
Yeah, and with a whole bunch of motivations that are much murkier than people realize, for sure. Okay, I want to shift back to the other parts of the book sure. Because we're already going super long, so we might as well make this the one-stop shop for everybody who's interested about every environmental question. Because a lot of the chapters in your book are related to things that are totally separate than what we've just been talking about. But we had to go into a lot of detail on what we just discussed because it's probably what's up and front and center on people's minds. But back to, I want to delve into this question about, which we talked about at the beginning, which was, and it's in the title of the book, Apocalypse Never. The point being that, of course, climate change is real. It's of course humans caused it, at least some of it. Who knows to what degree, but that's the premise that we start off of. The question is, what are the actual results? And one thing that everybody seems to argue about when they start to dive down into the costs of climate change is the effects on weather, right? Extreme weather events. And we talked about it briefly, but this gets really confusing for people because experts sort of fling studies at each other. Well, there's less forest fires or there's more forest fires. Well, the forest fires are hotter, so they burn more. Or there's less hurricanes or there's more hurricanes. Right. Maybe the same amount of hurricanes, but the hurricanes have, 30% more rainfall than they otherwise would have. What is the truth on this? It's so confusing for the average person. And it's hard to sift through it all. So, I mean, how do we even agree on the premise of the results of climate change?
Okay, let me say it in the simplest way, and then let me make it a little more complicated. The simplest way to think of it is that climate change is a very small factor among many larger factors in terms of floods, hurricanes, forest fires, and just how we deal with those events. So let's just take forest fires. Is the fire season getting longer in California and Australia because of climate change? Yes, it is. That's true, and I talk about it. Does that lengthening of the fire season explain the increase in frequency and severity of forest fires? No. In fact, the increase in the severity and frequency of forest fires can be entirely explained by two things: the buildup of wood fuel in mountain forests and more housing near forests. And that's true for both Australia and California. Like, full stop. Now, am I saying that climate change isn't making isn't having some impact? No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, you can't see it because the effect of the accumulation of wood fuel and more houses near forests explains all of the increase. Same thing for, you look at things like, I just went through with my house testimony, malaria, dengue fever, other infectious diseases. Can you make the case that climate change will result in more places having malarial conditions, namely standing pools of water, right, in warm temperatures? You can, sure. But the big factors over whether or not there's more malaria are whether we actually modify landscapes basically by draining wetlands or spraying insecticide inside of barrels of water for dengue, or having mosquito nets, or applying insecticide on homes. Those things all will determine how bad malaria gets, right? So it's just economic development is just outweighing climate change. Am I saying that will always be the case? No, but there's not a good scenario where we see somehow a reversal of the decline of infectious disease, global burn of infectious disease, or of disasters. So that's kind of, that's me trying to cut through it all. And similarly with sea levels, you kind of go, I've had people go, well, Michael, what about the sea level? There's parts of Florida, that they're going to have to abandon the coast. And I'm kind of like, great. As an environmentalist, there's too many people on the coasts. I don't care. Stop pretending like that's even. So some of it's both exaggerating the effect of climate change among many other factors, and it's exaggerating the actual events themselves. Hurricane Katrina wasn't because of climate change. It was because the levees failed, what we call the disaster that is Hurricane Katrina. The levees broke and the Ninth Ward was already under sea level. And so this is how you get all those deaths. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that, in the scope of human history, Hurricane Katrina is not apocalyptic. It was bad. It was terrible. We should condemn all the forces that led to it. But it's not like it resulted in a breakdown of civilization or something. So I think the exaggerations are taking place at both of those levels.
Yeah, and on the hurricane one in particular, and I focus on that one because I'm from Houston and we deal with hurricanes all the time. We always have, and so the argument is that we had excess rainfall because of climate change. When you look into that claim, it's based on modeling. I'm always skeptical of things that are based on modeling as opposed to true data. But what does your research say about this?
I actually appreciate the skepticism of modeling, because I do think that's how things are hidden. There's just many assumptions that are getting made in those models that are hidden from view. So I appreciate that. I tend to just kind of accept many of the models, because when you kind of look at it, you go, okay, so they go, no, the flooding is going to be so much more worse because of the additional precipitation. And you're like, well, how much additional precipitation are we talking about? And it'll be like 2 to 3 inches. Well, like Greta Thunberg today tweeted I was going to respond, I just didn't have time. She tweeted these scenes of floods in India where, like, the flooding is like people are like swimming, right? Like it's proper, like serious flooding, suggesting that that's somehow because of climate change. It's like, that's just wrong. Like, that's because they don't have a flood management system, because the government's too corrupt and is too dysfunctional to create a proper flood management system. Houston has a world-class hurricane disaster response flood management system and has managed, and that's why deaths from disasters, hurricanes and flooding, have been going down. Like, it's not, we've been doing a really good job. And so you kind of go, but we're going to have a couple more inches of precipitation. Like, I live on a hillside in Berkeley, and when it rains really hard, that water comes flooding down the hillsides. But we've got this beautiful system of gutters and a whole system that basically takes the water out to the bay and diverts it from around my house. Well, I kind of, in the book, I go to the Congo and I point out that, like, the reason the Congo is flooded is the same reason as India. They don't have a flood management system. So stop blaming climate change for poverty, basically, or for underdevelopment.
Yeah. And again, it goes back to the thing I want to know is, okay, so if we stopped all emissions now, would we see a few inches less of rainfall for any given hurricane? And I don't think anybody can say that with any certainty. It's quite a wild claim, but it's the proper question to ask, following that claim, I would think.
Yeah, but it's also like so. But even if it were 3 more inches, like the 3 inches is nothing compared to the difference between having a proper flood management system and not.
Right, I mean, right. If you're going to invest in something, it should be a proper flood management system.
I mean, it's bizarre because environmentalists all go to Amsterdam. Like, liberals, we love Amsterdam, and Venice, Italy, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, these are cities where, like, they've completely constructed around water. Like, water's like heavily like this idea that we're like somehow helpless against 3 inches of additional rainfall a year. For me, it's another symptom of just the complete alienation from not just nature, but from kind of our basic infrastructure. I mean, I don't blame anybody in some sense. Like, it's a sign of our success. We're so rich. When you visit a poor, I know you probably did even in your service in the military. I mean, when you visit poor and developing countries, you really have to go to poor and developing countries to appreciate why we're so rich in the United States. That what makes us rich are all these things we don't see. We don't see the pipes and the wires and the gutters and the sewage systems I have a whole chapter on plastic waste. We don't see the fact that, like, the plastic waste is all carefully managed, and so these are just questions of development. And so what bothers me is that in service of what is fundamentally an anti-development, anti-growth agenda, you have activists basically pointing to examples of disasters, particularly in poor countries, but also here, pointing to examples of disasters that are a consequence of the lack of infrastructure and development and civilization, not from climate change. And they're using that to advance policies that would basically maintain that level of underdevelopment.
Yeah, I mean, a perfect example is San Diego and Tijuana. I lived in San Diego for 10 years, and one of our biggest issues there is sometimes the beaches will have to be closed because the ocean water is so gross. Okay, why is it gross? Is it because Californians are polluting the water? No, not even close. It's because the Tijuana River, without any infrastructure, without any proper sewage system, anytime it rains, and hell, even if it's not raining these days, it just floods excrement into the water, and that flows into the beaches of San Diego. We have to close them. It's a problem, but it's entirely due to lack of infrastructure and lack of development. not the opposite. And this gets to the plastics question as well, which you write about. I want to get to that in a second, actually, because while we're still on carbon emissions, sort of, I just want to ask a basic question. Because you talk about Amazon deforestation, and there's a lot of debunking about what the Amazon actually provides in way of CO2 reduction, but also oxygen emission. I don't want to actually dive into that. I just want to ask a simpler question: Is it reasonable to suggest that a proper way to reduce carbon emissions worldwide would be to have a kind of a massive tree planting exercise? Is that reasonable at all?
No, it's a complete distraction, and it's like a meme that keeps resurfacing in the mainstream discourse. I think I'm over a decade older than you, but that was like, I feel like I've seen like 3 waves of this tree planting will save the climate stuff since the 90s. No, I mean, first of all, it's impractical, it's expensive. But the main event is just moving towards energy sources that produce less pollution of all kinds, including carbon emissions.
Yeah.
Land. I mean, particularly there's this. I think there's a lot of things where people go, if we scaled this up globally, or if every nation decided to do that, it's like, forget about it. I mean, energy and food decisions, which are the 2 big things that we're concerned about when you're looking at the environment and climate. Questions of food and energy are just decided by nations, and in the United States, and big countries like the United States, they're often decided by county and state governments, not by the United Nations. So things just don't work like that. It's better to look at the trends. And that's why I spend a lot of time just kind of being like, what is the trend over the last 100 or 200 years? And because I think there's a lot of people who are like, yeah, if we just completely changed this trend, which exists for, whatever, for these macro reasons. I mean, here, I'll give you the big thing to know on trees is that we are adding a lot of trees and greenery and biomass in the rich world, in Europe and the United States and Canada, and even in richer Asian countries. And we're losing them in poorer ones. And that makes sense because they're developing and they're converting their forests into farmland. So, the first thing to know about the Amazon is like, everybody just calm down for a minute when you remember that the Brazilians are doing to their forests what Europeans and Americans did, which is that we're converting our forests into ranches and farmlands. We can maybe help them to do that better, or we might pay them not to, although that hasn't actually worked. But we can't. What we can't do is actually ask that they stay poor, because that's first of all, it's immoral, and second of all, it's not going to work. So land use. That's why I just think when you're talking about climate and emissions, you focus on energy, because questions of land use just have to do with how you're producing food, and those are obviously deeply important questions to any nation being able to survive and thrive.
Yeah, and one thing you point out, it's concerning when the World Bank and other international development organizations prioritize wind and solar so much for developing nations, and it just won't work for them, and also has the environmental consequences that we've laid out in excruciating detail. Okay, back to the plastics, because I don't want to lose track of that one. The straws, we are virtue signaling like crazy in America, not using plastic straws. Makes us feel really good to have that soggy paper straw in our mouth at Starbucks in our plastic cups. But like, is it America that's really pumping plastic into the oceans? Is that on us and the Europeans and developed countries? I mean, what's really happening here?
Yeah. Well, so first of all, 0.03% of the 9 million tons of plastic waste that ends up in the ocean every year is straws. So it's just virtue signaling in the extreme. Plastic waste does kill sea life, and so I do worry about it for that reason. But yeah, I mean, the reason that the vast majority of the plastic waste in the oceans is from poor countries that don't have waste management systems. As you get wealthier, as you develop, you either incinerate or landfill your waste, depending on if you have enough land available for landfilling. Europe tends to incinerate more, the United States tends to landfill more. But the big thing, of course, again, people that claim to be environmentalists or care about the environment know nothing about how nature actually works. First thing you learn in your ecological biology class, at least I did when I was a freshman in college, is that the solution to pollution is dilution. Do you remember that? When we were lefties, so we would change that to being the solution to pollution is revolution.
Okay.
Most plastics disintegrate. So, they went out and did this really careful study, and what they discovered is that they could only find in the oceans about 0.1% of the world's annual plastic waste production. 100 times less microplastic that had been expected. So basically, plastics are broken down. Mostly broken down. I'm not saying it's not a problem. I do think we don't want plastic waste in the ocean. Okay, so we should help countries to develop so that they have waste management systems. But it's been so grossly exaggerated. And when you really look at, because the oceans are not in great shape, we eat too many fish. The whales are coming back, but it's taken a while because they're such big mammals. You want to have, the sea turtles are coming back, but they're still getting hammered. We need to do better, in terms of sea life. But I wouldn't put plastic waste at the top of my list.
Well, I don't want to diminish plastic waste. My point was more that when I have this conversation with somebody and that they're like, I don't use plastics anymore. And I'm like, okay, but what do you think happens when you throw that plastic bottle away in the trash can here in Houston? And they're like, I don't know. It could end up in the ocean. And I'm like, no, it's not. If you're a jerk and you throw it on the street and it gets into a storm drain, then yeah, it's probably going into the ocean. But, that's illegal already, and we shouldn't do that. And we should figure out how to stop that. But when you get it into the trash, it's not going into the ocean because this is the United States. Again, it goes back to the San Diego Tijuana thing. It's not the tributaries in California that are expelling tons of trash into the ocean. It's like, the statistics, like 95% of the Pacific garbage patch is from a few different rivers, and they're all in Asia. We need to focus our efforts on that, internationally speaking, and in the overfishing. The overfishing, I think, is certainly something we could agree on. It's devastating, but again, it's like, I think you've noted some places in your book too, how, fishing, fish farms that are, I guess, quote unquote artificial, are hammered by environmentalists. But there's no need for that. It just means we're fishing less in the ocean, which should be a good thing, right?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, this is crazy that environmentalists have been opposed to aquaculture, particularly land-based aquaculture, so that you're actually producing the fish on land rather than in ocean inlets, for example, which can create pollution. As usual, there were problems with earlier farmed fish and earlier aquaculture, but boy, they've just gotten much better, much cleaner, much healthier. And this is one of the big lessons from the book that I wanted to emphasize, is that the transition from using natural products to using artificial products is good for the environment. It's not good for the environment to use the environment. If you want to save nature, don't use it. And yet it's interesting. So one of the big kind of surprises, delightful surprises, the plastics chapter was super fun. I didn't know anything about, I knew when I decided to write this book, I knew most of the topical areas. I'd written on them for a while, but plastics was something I'd never written on. So actually, I think a lot of people really like the chapter because there's so many kind of fun discoveries. I mean, one of the funnest discoveries is that I opened the chapter by describing this viral video of a biologist pulling a plastic straw out of the nose of a sea turtle. Well, the sea turtles she works with, one of them, a species called the hawksbill, its shell, it was hunted almost to extinction for its shell, which was heated and molded as the original plastic. So what we call tortoise shell eyeglasses or jewelry. I'm wearing a pair right now. The tortoise shell they were referring to was sea turtle shell. Well, the substitute, the alternative that ended up saving the sea turtle was plastics made from fossil fuels. Same thing for elephant tusks. We used to use elephant tusks to make billiard balls, to make piano keys. Well, we invented plastics, and plastics acted as substitutes for those natural products. Now, the funny thing is that, and this is, I think, where environmentalism is really a kind of luxury branding effort, has always been that way, is that as soon as the plastic tortoise shell started replacing authentic tortoise shell, demand among affluent Japanese customers for authentic tortoiseshell went up. And the same thing actually happened a little bit in China with ivory. As Chinese got rich, it increased demand for ivory from elephant tusks, and so the punchline is, using artificial products, it saves nature. We should want to use artificial fish, so to speak, artificial energy in the form of petroleum rather than whale oil, artificial plastics rather than elephant tusks and sea turtle shells. That's the picture that I want people to have, because I think that this is where I think so much of environmentalism is just an effort to return to the womb or to the Garden of Eden or some harmony or some, I think, unhealthy breaking down of boundaries between humans and nature, when really what saves nature is by not using it. And that means creating these alternatives.
Yeah, and you point out like the banning of plastic bags. Again, it feels good, but what is it really doing? Because as it turns out, when you use paper bags or the other thicker reusable bags that I admit I even will use, it turns out that how much more carbon emissions is there for those paper bags and thick nylon bags or whatever we're using just to produce those things. And it turns out when studies are done on this, it's like, I forget, like 20 or 30 times more carbon emissions per bag. It's an absurd number.
Yeah, there's definitely way more carbon emissions to produce paper bags than plastic bags. And not only that, but the plastic bags are made from a byproduct from the petrochemical industry already. So it's not like there's some idea that like by buying plastic, you're keeping us addicted to fossil fuels. It's nonsense.
Right. And also, and you could justify it perhaps if you knew for a fact that when you use that plastic bag, it was going to go wrap itself around a turtle's neck. But again, we live in America with the waste disposal infrastructure where that just doesn't happen.
Well, again, it's even worse than that. I mean, by insisting on recycling, crappy plastic bags and plastic products, we're not actually mostly recycling it. This is the dirty little secret, is that often.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about recycling. Like, what's the truth of recycling?
Yeah, so they often shipped it to Asia with the idea that the Asians would recycle it, but the Asians actually ended up dumping it, and a lot of it went into the oceans. So, I mean, China actually just ended up, I described how they ended up just rejecting finally all this plastic waste coming in. But no, clearly, and then by the way, you put the plastic waste in a landfill and it sequesters the carbon. And then if you have a proper operating landfill, it's capturing the methane and burning the methane, often for power. That's what's often called cogeneration. So, yeah, I mean, again, eventually I think if you have a nuclear society, you're probably going to still use fossil fuels to make plastics because they have so much tremendous advantage. Bioplastics, by the way, we looked into bioplastics for this, and they're just as terrible as you might imagine. They're just as bad as biofuels. So biofuels are more polluting than gasoline, and they actually are devastating to landscapes because, of course, we get the petroleum from underground, and with biofuels, you have to grow them above ground. So we find sugar-based bioplastics emit more methane than fossil fuel plastics. Decomposing bioplastics produce more air pollution than sending ordinary plastics to landfills. And because bioplastics come from crops grown rather than the resin waste product from the oil and gas industry, they have large land use impacts, just like biofuels have from corn ethanol in the United States to palm oil in Indonesia, where they've destroyed the habitat of endangered orangutans. So, yeah, it's just, I point out replacing fossil fuel plastics, the dominant plastics we use, with corn-based bioplastics would require 30 to 45 million acres of corn added to production, which is about 40% of our entire corn harvest. I mean, mostly we don't want to expand the human footprint if you care about the natural world, and yet that's what moving towards biofuels and bioplastics would do.
Yeah, but it makes people feel good. You really just throw cold water on so many potential solutions that a lot of people gravitate towards, whether it's, hey, put more ethanol in the fuel, right? It feels good. Like it feels like you're doing something natural. Or the trees, plant more trees. You've successfully debunked even some things that I thought were were probably decent solutions that we could move towards. Okay, so we got, let's see, the plastic debate, the ethanol or biofuel debate. Okay, the last one, unless you have more. What I wanted to ask about was, okay, the farting cows. Okay, so AOC says we're not going to have any cows anymore. What do we need to know about what the proper way is to grow beef, and what works and what doesn't, as it relates to, again, like conservation, but also carbon emissions?
Yeah, I mean, so the first thing is, so the headline that came out last year or the year before, I think it was last year, was that if everybody goes vegan, we'll cut our land-based emissions 70%. Sounds like a lot, right? 70%. But you'll notice what I said very quickly there was I said land-based emissions. So actually, the best available science shows that if you go vegetarian, not even full vegan, you'll reduce your emissions somewhere between 2 and 4%. So in terms of climate change, it's irrelevant. Vegetarianism, just totally irrelevant. So I hope my gift to the world is giving vegans and vegetarians one less thing to moralize about. Not that will stop them. And then in terms of meat production, so meat production is of significant concern to people that care about wildlife and conservation. And so humans, just a shorthand, humans use about half of the ice-free surface of the Earth. Just 0.5% of that is for cities. Another 0.5% of that is for energy production. 25% of that is for livestock and pasture for meat production. And then the rest is for some combination of crops and wood, forestry. So meat is literally, it's shocking. 1/4 of the ice-free surface of the Earth is for pasture production. So how do you get that number down? And this is a big problem because everywhere you go in the world, I talk about the mountain gorillas in Central Africa, the yellow-eyed penguins in Australia. What's competing for habitat in so many cases with those endangered species? It's cows. Okay, so now unless you think people are going to stop eating meat, which I don't think they are. And in fact, I point to this research that shows that the number of people that are vegetarian has been steady for like 100, 200 years. And in fact, most vegetarians confess in studies, this was delightful, that they eat meat. The vast majority of vegetarians actually eat meat, which shows that it's an ideology, by the way, more than a diet. So the punchline is very simple: produce more meat on less land. Like, that's it. Like, so how do you do that? Well, that's kind of the process of what's already been going on for the last 100 years, because it's more economical that way. Land is expensive and valuable. It should be. So you want to just grow more meat on more cows on less land. Okay, then you have ethical considerations. Aren't the cows happier if they have more space? No, they're not. That's a complete anthropomorphization of what cows want. And so I describe this wonderful person named Temple Grandin, who was one of the first people to ever be out about being autistic. And she became famous because she did these really close studies of the emotions of livestock. And she figured out that really what cows care about was things like having a clean stall and not having like big swinging chains and shadows and loud noises. But that the cows actually are fine being more concentrated. So then you kind of go, well, what about coronavirus and other viruses that could spread from wild animals to livestock to people, like the current coronavirus? There too, you actually want to have what you need are big, clean, well-capitalized facilities so that they don't allow bats to roost above the pigs or the cows. And so you can regularly test the livestock and the workers. So basically, this industrial agriculture, which has been demonized by vegetarians and organic food enthusiasts, that's what's best for people and the environment. It's also what's best. It also makes for cheaper meat, which we should want. This is another thing people are wrong. You should want cheap meat because it's a substitute for eating wild meat. And one of the biggest threats to wild animals in poor countries, which is where so much of the wildlife that we care about is located, is to provide cheap cow, pigs, and chickens so that they don't eat primates and monkeys and other wild animals that we're trying to protect.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, what it goes to show, and in all of these issues, there's trade-offs. And it seems that in the broader discussion about environmentalism, there's never been a truly honest discussion of trade-offs and costs and benefits, and it's just really it's corrupted the conversation to an enormous extent, and I think prevented us from what could be largely agreed upon common sense measures for a generally cleaner environment. And also the term environment has been relegated to only one thing, which is carbon emissions. Whereas it really should encompass a broader range of meaning, like wildlife and land usage and, rivers and lakes and oceans. And it's these trade-offs and these discussions are extremely important.
Yeah,
what else do we miss?
There's definitely trade-offs and cost benefit, but there's also a pattern of rising energy consumption, moving from energy dilute to energy dense, and even increasing power densities of food production is what makes for better environmental outcomes. And so the demonization of energy, what we should, I think of it in simple terms, there's energy and matter. What's matter? Natural resources. You want to use less matter and you want to use more energy, and you're able to use less matter by using more energy. And so what you want is powered. You want power dense farms. You want farms that use a lot of energy. Eventually, stuff will be grown in greenhouses super efficiently, and that will mean that there'll be more of the countryside for forests and wild animals and grasslands and the things that we all care about.
Yeah, but you can't get there without energy use and technological innovation and development.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, okay. That was only 2 hours. What did we miss?
Well, I've had a really great time, Congressman, and I really appreciate you taking the time. And I think you've been a really important, independent, and authentic voice for a bunch of these big issues. And, I was particularly glad to talk to you about nuclear because I do think America's national security is threatened by the deliberate and manufactured decline of nuclear energy in the United States. And I think that's an issue that is more important than climate change, and certainly more urgent than any environmental issue that I can think of. So I appreciate you taking the time, and would love to stay in touch as we kind of figure out how to get our country. My broader view is that many of the problems that we're having are the fact that we have no national identity, we have no national religion that binds us together as Democrats and Republicans, as red states and blue states, as heartland states and coastal states, and that we need every institution in our society and globally, from the World Health Organization to the Congress to the New York Times, to the CDC. It seems like these institutions are all failing because they're stuck in an older way of thinking about the world, and they need new leaders and new ideas. And I see you as definitely at the top of the list of Republicans who I think are really rethinking, what it means to be a Republican and what it means to be a conservative for the new century.
I appreciate that. And we certainly, I think we have a national identity, but I think it's under attack. And I think we need to regain it. I think we've had a lot of great ideas since our founding, that we are, for some reason, especially in 2020, we seem hell-bent on forgetting and doing away with, in search of some strange utopia or dystopia. And it's concerning.
I think so too. I think so. If we know what that is from the radical left, which is anti-civilizational values, and it wants to destroy a bunch of important institutions, whether it's been after mental institutions, nuclear power plants, police forces, universities. But I think that the Republicans on the right have, I think we're at the end of a kind of reflexive libertarian market orientation. And even the kind of, because you kind of go, if you have a social contract, it's not just freedom. Like, freedom's not enough anymore. that like there's some. It seems to me that if you go out, if we were to go out in Houston or in Berkeley and ask people like what do we feel like we owe each other as Americans, and why should we even bother having a United States of America rather than just splitting ourselves into two? I'm not sure that people have very good answers right now, or they know what the answer is. And I don't think it's just freedom and individual responsibility, as important as I think those values are. I think there's some question going on here, which is like, what do we owe our fellow American, both in terms of all the stuff around masks and the pandemic, but what do we owe each other as Americans in terms of the opioid epidemic and the housing crisis? And it just seems like there's questions that are being asked about what is the new social contract. And I think both left and right are going to have to have answers to those questions, and hopefully have some new agreement, because I think there's a potential to have some significant agreement. But I think that's going to look different than what it's been over the last 30 or 50 years.
Yeah, and that is the philosophical conversation of the future, and most likely the future of the Republican Party is sort of the people who feel this way. Let's call them older Democrats, the Labor Party of old, the working class, searches for something new. And I've never been a libertarian because it in and of itself is utopianism in its thinking. And there does have to be an honest social contract, but it has to be guarded by principles of individual liberty and conservatism and basic good governance. And that's where I think the left goes way off the rails. But we have to have that conversation with people, because a lot of people certainly feel that way, as you described.
Yeah.
But that's a different conversation, a different podcast, one which we've had a lot on this podcast, actually.
Really nice to meet you. And I'm really appreciate you taking the time. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. Thank you for your work. And thanks for going into all the detail on all of these things. I think people will get a lot out of this conversation, hit a lot of topics that people are curious about and don't always know where to find the answers. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
All right.